Good evening. Really nice to see you here this evening. This series of spirituality classes are going to delve into the realm of emotions. Now, I think that you're quite familiar with your emotions, but I think after several sessions, you'll discover that you weren't. And hopefully, as a consequence of these sessions, you'll be much, much more in touch, much, much more practiced, feel the things that you desire to feel, and thereby relationships will flower, your sense of well-being will improve considerably, and you'll be a happier person. That's the promise. Those of you who may not feel like that means you weren't listening closely enough. Okay? I'm going to deal this evening with the phenomenon of fear and also its opposite, courage. These are big words that we don't have clarity when we use them in the English language. We all have a common understanding of what fear is, but if we were to define it, it would be difficult, which I'll demonstrate to you shortly. On the front page here, page 1, it's double-sided. On page 1, you've got a diagram which is a common diagram that you will have seen in a number of different places, usually referred to as the Kabbalistic diagram of the tree of life or what have you, but I don't use such terms. I use the more traditional terms. This is the Sefirot and their interrelationships. What are Sefirot? Well, to answer that question, we have to ask ourselves, who are we? You and I, as the opening section of the Chumash informs us, you and I are the image of the cosmos, the image of God itself, but in human format. Everything about us symbolically points at a higher reality, a higher us. Whether it be our hands, whether it be our hair, whether it be our toenails, everything is significant. There's nothing that's insignificant. So those of you who had, in previous generations, there was quite common to take out little bits of the body because you were getting colds all the time up there. What were they called? Tonsils, or the appendix, etc., because it was suggested they were useless. They weren't useless. We may not know their usefulness, that's a separate matter. But everything is significant. Therefore, if we look at ourselves, we can understand the higher reality. The material hints at the spiritual. As I said to another class today, every one of our experiences in life, seeing, hearing, tasting, our 5 senses, what are they? Thinking, what is that? If I were to ask you, where do you think, with what part of the body, most of you would automatically do something like this. And if I were to ask you, where do you feel, you'd probably do something like this. Why? Because you have a brain and you have a heart. But guess what? When you die, please God, till 120, you don't have to worry about that. You still have a head and you still have a heart. And guess what? You are not thinking and you are not feeling. Why? Because you'll say, because you're dead. But that doesn't answer anything. You've still got the total physiological integrity of brain and heart. And nevertheless, it doesn't operate because obviously there is an energy system that utilizes the physiological machinery called body to manifest itself. And that spiritual energy we refer to as the neshama, colloquially. the soul, for want of a better English term. So the energy has to navigate through the machinery of the body in order to express in a finite world, because the neshama is from infinite stuff and can't manifest, and somehow it interfaces through the body and does. When it interfaces with machinery called I, E-Y-E, we have a wonderful experience called seeing. When it manifests through another piece of complex machinery called brain, we call that thinking. That's our experience of it. Through the ear, we call that hearing. Those verbs are an expression of our experience. All those experiences together are referred to loosely as consciousness. So consciousness is not just here, but it's all over. Within the spiritual energy, there are channels, there are aptitudes, there are potentia. We call those sephirot. That's what the subject matter of this diagram. A sephirah is the abstract spiritual potential for its expression. When it is ultimately actualized, it becomes our experience of emotions or mind. So if you were to say, I feel happy or I feel sad, that is already the human expression of the potential within the neshama for simcha, joy, expressing itself through the physiology of the heart, and we experience happiness, or its opposite. So that's the model. We are dualistic creatures, made up of the duality of guf, which means body, and neshama, which loosely means soul. And every one of our experiences takes in these sephirotic energy flows, humanizes them, if you will, through our body, and results in what we call emotions or mind. There are three aspects of mind, as you see here in blue: Chochmah, Bina, and Da'as. They aren't going to concern us so much in this series. We're going to be concentrating on the 7 that are in red, which are the 7 emotional aptitudes: Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, and Malchus, of which the first 2 are the primary ones, and by and large we'll be referring to the first 2, Chesed and Gevurah. So since these 2 are the 2 primary sephirot that become expressed as emotion, let's look at them and ask ourselves, what do they mean? So Chesed is that aspect of the cosmos flowing through us that allows us to express outward. It becomes humanized as giving, sharing, contributing, outward flow. That is its anthropomorphic sense. Whereas Gevurah is its equal and opposite. It's the aptitude of withholding, containing within. Every one of our thoughts, every one of our words, every one of our behaviors is always an expression of some balance between these 2. You're not completely this, and you're not completely that, but you balance it out according to your wisdom of the moment or your habitual default response, whatever might be the case, but it's a product of those 2. When I use the word wisdom, I'm referring to the first 3, the blue ones, Chochmah, Bina, and Da'as. That's our mind. The mind is the compass. It provides direction for our feelings. And the midos, the 7 emotional attributes, are the energy flows that we experience as feelings. So that's, in short, an overview. We'll be coming back to this diagram over and over again, because within the context of these words and this diagram lies the totality of all human experience and the totality of all the dynamics that exist in the cosmos, down to the most fine spiritual arenas at the highest levels. This one model summarizes them all. And there are discourses of sometimes hundreds of pages on any one interrelationship. The literature is vast. You don't have easy access to it because it's in Hebrew. But a lot of it now has started to be translating, so you could possibly access it as you choose. Any questions so far?
Yes, I thought the opposite to fear is love.
There are many ways in which we haven't yet defined fear, so you're jumping the gun by suggesting that. It can be. We have to find out first what is fear, then maybe look at what is love, and then decide whether in fact they are on the same spectrum and what is their common non-denominator. Let's look at that. So I'm going to ask you to practice a little bit of delayed gratification, and we'll get to some answers shortly. Anything else? Yes.
A recent report I read a week ago discovered just for appendix. That appendix is actually serving like rebooting good sculpture in a bowel system.
Good. Fine. Supporters of appendix will now be very, very glad. Okay, having said that, let's now ask ourselves the question which you began to raise. What is fear? Turn the page, and perhaps rather than asking you to use words to define it, let's look at circumstances so we can actually begin to tease out, to draw out what the meaning is. Look at these 10 features of life. Without sharing, identify which three of these in your life produce fear. Spare notes? Spare notes? When you have identified them, look at all of them and try to work out what is the common denominator behind all of these, although they may look totally unrelated. What does the unknown have to do with disappointment, have to do with failure, have to do with loneliness? Is there a common denominator that you can pick out from these set of circumstances? That you can raise your voice and volunteer to me.
A lack of something.
A lack of something, fine. Keep going. A lack of control.
Needs are not being met.
Needs not being met.
It's something from the outside, like
Outside of you happens to you, so it's not dissimilar to what was said, your inability to control something beyond you. A way of viewing something. In other words, you're suggesting that these may not be objectively real, but can actually have nuances based on our attitude to circumstances. Let's take the most radical one. Let's take death. Death is the absence of life. Death is the ultimate separation. Death is a disconnect between neshama and guf, between soul and body. The common denominator behind all these, I'm going to suggest to you, and you can test it out, is a disconnect. Let's test it. Losing your freedom. What does freedom provide you with? A capacity of expressing yourself freely. Choice. You're losing your freedom. You're disconnected from that capacity momentarily. The unknown, that's a little bit more abstract. That's a disconnect from what?
Certainty.
From certainty, control, future, knowledge. Yeah. You don't have the data. It's a disconnect from appreciating or having a sense of circumstances around you. Pain, that's an interesting one. What is pain a reference to? What does pain... Let's talk about common pain called a little paper cut on your finger. What is that discomfort? Pain is an expression that in some small or major way, the neshama is not flowing optimally through the body. You're not 100%. The severer the disconnect, the severer the pain. Pain is a very good indicator that there is a gap between the soul's wish to express and the body's momentary inability to facilitate it. We experience that as pain. And emotional pain, likewise. Disappointment. Look at the next one. What's disappointment? What could that be in context of a disconnect? Yes. You had a certain vision of outcome and you were rudely disconnected from it. That rude disconnection is experienced as disappointment amongst other possibilities. Misery. What does it mean to live a life of misery? It's a disconnect from your idealized perception of what could be. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a subjective experience of misery. Loneliness. That's a very obvious disconnect. What is it? A disconnect from people. Relationship. The relationship may be with people. That's the most dominant one for human beings. But it could be with any of the four levels of existence: human, animal, vegetational, and inanimate. Ridicule. Why do you feel such discomfort in the experience of ridicule?
Lack of appreciation or acceptance.
You've been disconnected from the circumstance. You've been disconnected from the situation. It's more than just being disconnected from a person. Ridicule means that you perceive yourself as disconnected from others as well. You have been made to look ridiculous. Rejection, obviously. Death, the most powerful one. Failure. So I think we can conclude quite safely that if we were going to look at the nature of fear, fear is the human response to a state of disconnect of some kind. physical disconnect, emotional disconnect. These are not my ideas, by the way. These are concepts that I learned from the texts and from my teachers. I'm just here tonight as a conduit to share these with you. This is where the Hasidic teachings of Kabbalah become practicalized. The difference between Kabbalah and Hasidus is Kabbalah is fairly abstract, fairly mystical, very difficult to access. The language is difficult to understand, and Hasidus takes that and practicalizes it in a language and in concepts that you and I can relate to. That was the phenomenon of the literary development of the 18th century, beginning with the Baal Shem Tov and moving forward, and specifically with the Lubavitcher Rebbes. Okay, so that's those two. Now, if you were to go back momentarily to the diagram, the first two red ones, Chesed and Gevura, you'll recall how I briefly define them. Do you recall which one of these two is likely to be associated with disconnect? The Gevura. If Gevura is this, inward, it means it's not that. That, Chesed, therefore means connect. And love is the pinnacle of its expression. And that's why we seek love so actively. Because love means connection. And the whole function of life, since the moment of birth, is a constant process of seeking connection. The baby, growing, experiments with connection. And one of its highlights, somewhere in its early months, is when it's waving its hands in front of its eyes and wondering where did these hands come from, without recognizing the connection of baby to its hands. And then comes a wonderful realization at some stage that I actually connect to these hands. And you know what? The hands can do what I want them to do. There's a connection. That's an absolutely wondrous moment of realization, except that we're so young and our minds are not so developed that we haven't intellectualized that at the time. We can only look back and have the enjoyment of knowing that's what must have happened. But everything we do as a human being is a quest for connectedness, of which love is the most powerful emotional expression. So in one sense, you are absolutely correct that love is the opposite of fear. But we're using here these sessions not so much to understand opposites as much as to understand the tools to undo the negative. And the tool to undo the negative of fear is courage. So that's why I've got it here as its contrast. Okay, so if Gevura, constricting inwards, is the most dominant feature of disconnect, what must we do in order to undo Gevura and to balance it more with Chesed? We have to have the courage of connecting. And I say courage because it is difficult. In terms of knowledge, for example, information, a difficult book, a person who's not clear. What's our experience of that? It's called frustration. Frustration is an expression of that disconnect. And if it is something which in some shape or form has a more powerful effect on us, it can become a fear. All these words, like frustration and pain and fear are related, but they're all part of disconnect. So to be able to overcome it, we need to increase the quantum of flow of chesed. But there are other features of our everyday life that can be conducive to overcoming states of fear. Fear and love are heightened states. You don't usually operate in a great state of fear or an ecstatic state of love. Most of our 24 hours of the day are in various stages in between those two extremes. And we can artificially heighten those sensitivities for the good or for the bad. So if a person is in a state of fear for whatever reason, or they have some sort of result of trauma, or they have some formative childhood shadow that affects them in the present moment, some of the external features that can heighten that need to be removed, like eliminating stimulants, caffeine, sugar, and the like. Avoiding biological irritants called people you don't like. They are the irritants. In fact, they become very major irritants. Now, I agree that you can't always avoid that, but to the best of your abilities, you can to some extent. Stay away from media reports. Go on a media fast. Try not to get yourself in traffic jams by taking the longer, short route rather than the short one, which will be longer. Don't impose deadlines in your life. So these various aspects are external things that you can control and do to create a state which is more level playing field. Then there is another very important conscious one, and that is what we call the relaxation response. In other words, when you've got an experience of anxiousness and worry and the like, of course, if that continues, it takes a biological toll on your health and well-being. It takes a mental toll on your balance of the mind. And the cause of that is because it's cumulative. If you allow worry to continue, stress to continue, anxiousness to continue, it'll knock you off balance. So you have to have a mechanism that interrupts that status quo so that you have a moment of reprieve. It won't solve your problem. We're not talking here about problem solving. That itself is very important, but not in this particular session. But you have to create a break. Take stress, for example. The problem with stress is cumulative stress. When stress builds upon stress, builds upon stress, builds upon stress, then the weight of that stress magnifies geometrically, not even arithmetically. But if you create a momentary break, that build-up of stress has to start again. And therefore the toll on your body and your mind is nowhere near as acute. So, one of the wonderful developments in more contemporary times has been the adoption of various exercises that you can practice in order to elicit the relaxation response. Dr. Herbert Benson in the late 70s and early 80s developed a very fine technique based on breathing and taking your focus on breath for an extended period of time. Extended means 2-3 minutes, not 2-3 hours. Physiologically alters you. If you practice that technique, it changes the measure of your skin resistance, the alpha wave activity from the brain to theta wave activity, your heart rate, pulse rate, and many other measurable physiological changes, which he proved simply by wiring a person up and measuring what happens when you practice these alternative focusing techniques. Breath, for many reasons, is a very, very good one. So what a relaxation response can do is to break the cycle, whether it be fear, whether it be frustration, whether it be worry or anxiousness. It doesn't solve the problem, but it interrupts that which can cause real damage to mind and body. Or why don't you have a nice warm bath with baking soda? And why don't you add a beautiful combination of vetiver essential oil, cedarwood oil, sandalwood oil, and jojoba oil, which is known to relax you. It's got properties for that. These are external things. I want to, however, deal now with the substance of the session, which is, apart from these external circumstances, how can you directly alter the internal state of being by a process called reframing. Now, what do I mean by reframing? What does a frame do for a painting? The frame can either make the painting look ugly or beautiful, strangely enough. In other words, the frame will alter our perception of the picture. Put a very inappropriate, garish frame on the beautiful picture, and the result will be that somehow or other everyone looks at the frame. What an ugly frame. You forget about the picture. What an ugly frame it is. I want us to learn to reframe the picture of a circumstance or the world. And that means reinterpretation. You've heard me, some of you have heard me give the following example, because I think it's a very real example. Someone is being rude to you, ugly to you, yelling at you, whatever might be the case. How do you respond? Well, obviously not you, because you are very spiritually developed, adept individuals who can respond appropriately in the moment. But out there in the world, there are many people who are unlike you. And the way that most people respond to that kind of provocation is they become monkeys. They copy the other person. They also yell and scream back, because our society has taught us that it's very important in the face of adversity to show muscle and to be able to compete and prove to yourself that you are somebody. And the way you do that most effectively to prove things to yourself is by raising your voice and raising the volume of your body, chest out, loud voice. But of course, what you're really doing is demonstrating that you had low self-esteem to start with. Because if you had appropriate self-esteem, there'd be no need to prove anything whatsoever. You wouldn't need to respond in kind. Instead, you would automatically reframe. Mean? You reinterpret the objective data. What's the objective data? That person is rude. That person is screaming. What does that mean? That person is suffering. That person is in pain. And therefore, what can I do to assist him or her? What has been my reinterpretation? What has been my reframing? My reframing is to have shifted from an egotistic point of view of me. How dare you speak to me like that? Because there is some vacuum within which you need to plug up. So you start strengthening yourself to plug it up. And instead, you've reframed, become empathic and compassionate, because you are a whole person. You don't need to defend yourself, but you do have an obligation under Jewish law to assist the other. How does that sound?
Amazing.
Yeah.
That is an example of reframing. The same in terms of fear. The approach that I'm going to suggest to you in terms of fear is to reframe. Who was it who said the only thing we need to fear is fear itself? It was an American president, right? Roosevelt. The only thing to fear is fear itself. What is fear? We're going back to basics, what the subject matter of today is all about. Fear is a disconnect. Fear is a disconnect of myself to the surrounding circumstances because I have insufficient data to control it. So what is the antidote to that? I don't control anything in life, especially not my children, which wise parents learn quicker rather than slower. You control nothing in life. You may think that you control. A dictator armed with a strong army can cower his or her subjects to obedience, can therefore control. And why would a dictator choose to do that? To avoid the fear of the unknown called democracy. There's a great degree of uncertainty in democratic processes. You may not be elected. And therefore, to achieve certainty, we exercise control. We don't want to be in a state of fear of not being the leader. I've simplified, but they're the basics. However, what will happen? Inevitably, the result will be a thing called rebellion. Because human beings, by nature, don't like to be controlled. The inner humanity will once again assert itself. Watch my words. In North Korea, we'll see it in our lifetime. In other words, it's against basic humanity. And therefore, all attempted control is always doomed to failure. Parenting. Sure, you can control your child. You can threaten your child. You can cajole your child. You can deprive your child. You've got a lot of mechanisms of forcing the child to conform. However, if that's your parenting style, inevitably in teenagehood, they will rebel. And because in today's world, you have a far greater capacity to escape geographically and emotionally, and that's called catching a plane or taking drugs. Both are escapes. That'll be the inevitability of the attempt to control. So if we want to overcome the fear of fear through control, it's doomed to failure. So what is our countermeasure to fear? And that is called emunah. Now, emunah is loosely translated in a very, very theological term called faith. I don't like it. The word emunah is also etymologically linked to the word amen. What's amen? You hear it a lot in churches and synagogues and things like that. But what does it really mean? Yeah, it's an agreement with, which derives in its own right from another Hebrew word. Amen and emunah derive from a word called omanut. And omanut, interestingly, translates as a trade. A tradesperson, a trade. What's the possible connection? So whereas generally speaking, loosely speaking, people talk about Amunah as faith. The Hasidic understanding of the word is much more profound. It goes like this. It's training oneself to interpret the world and circumstances in a specific manner. And what is that specific manner? That everything is exactly as it should be, no matter what. It may even be painful. It may be hurtful. But it is intended as a teacher and as a mechanism for your growth and your development. Can this be proven? No. Can it be disproven? No. So we're on equal ground. There's a 50 percentile probability that what I've said is utterly ridiculous, and another 50 percentile probability that it's got extreme wisdom. So you've got to choose. We spoke about duality and choice right at the beginning. However, if you choose the opposite, that there isn't any meaning, and life has its own somehow dynamic, irrespective of any purpose, logic, methodology, pattern, or otherwise, you will be doomed to fear. If you equally arbitrarily, because that's arbitrary what I said, but equally arbitrary choose that there is purpose, there's pattern, and there's meaning, and therefore that everything happens is purposeful, you will not experience that degree of fear. It's as simple as that. Stated simply, doing is something else. But remember, as a matter of philosophical deduction, logic, you're on equal ground choosing either one. The question is, what do you want your lives to be like? How happy or unhappy are you with my little discussion just then?
Sorry, so are you saying in simple words, just accept everything?
It's interesting what you asked, because we had a session this morning where we distinguished between acceptance and acknowledgement. What's the difference between acceptance and acknowledgement? And I said this morning, acknowledgement, yes. Acceptance, no. I know it's very popular in the literature today, especially the personal growth and spiritual literature, to talk about you must accept. Somehow there's great worthiness in accepting. And I teach, no. If you feel that it should not be, don't accept it. But you must acknowledge its existence in order to resist it, in order to change it. Because if you blind yourself to it, you'll never get a process of change. So you acknowledge, not accept. You're asking, Lolly, a different kind of question. The question is, do I have a choice? Or must I simply adopt what you're saying, Laibl? No, I gave you a specific alternative. Life is meaningless. It possesses no pattern. It has no purpose. It's a curious accident which we cannot possibly even understand, because even an accident must be a derivative of something else, and we don't understand how something can come from nothing. There must have been a first thing. What was that first thing? No idea. But that's all right. You can choose that, or you choose the opposite. And both choices are logically valid. Logically valid. One way, madness lies, and the other way, meaningfulness lies. These happen to be the products of those two pathways. But you have to choose.
It's very hard to choose. We didn't choose to be born.
Correct. But here you are.
How do you choose?
What you do is you sit down and you say, that one. That's how you choose. Okay? Otherwise, your life is going to be in limbo from 0 till 120. These are called axioms. Axiomatic propositions are ones which have no reason. They are the beginning points. These are the two beginning points. And if by the age of 25, which most of you are, you haven't yet resolved that, please do so quickly, because otherwise it's not going to be a useful and happy life. In fact, let me just simply challenge you. Spend 1 week on each. Spend 1 week, but truly, completely, 1 week, axiomatically, life is meaningless, it's all an accident. The following week, life is meaningful and purposeful, and you live like that. Try it. I mean, you've got a lot of time in your life. You can afford a week on each. Test it out. Okay? Yes.
Purpose. If life is purposeful and you elect to choose that option,
Yes.
what would the purpose be constructed as?
Here's where another very interesting word comes into play, and it's called anivut, or anava, which translates as humility. Because your brain and my brain is about 7 inches by 8 inches by 9 inches in the old measure. You can calculate it in centimetres if you like. And it's not 7 miles by 8 miles by 9 miles, or 7,000 miles by 8,000 miles by 9,000 miles. And one imagines that if you had a brain that was 7,000 miles by 8,000 by 9,000, it probably would be somewhat more powerful than yours and mine. And that means it could obviously induce things that you and I cannot. What would an infinite mind have the capacity of? So when you ask what is the ultimate purpose, it's as if you want to jump out of your brain and become God, by definition. Can't do it. We never will know the ultimate purpose. We can know secondary purposes and third-level purposes, only to the extent that perhaps if you're a believing individual, in the Torah we're given those. We're told that the reason Hashem created the world, because Hashem wanted physicality to be spiritualized. You can always ask why, and for that I'll have to say, you'll have to send a letter upstairs. I have no idea. So no, we don't know ultimate purposes.
I think the answer is that we are all here for a purpose. Everything in life has a purpose, whether it's a blade of grass growing up to produce seeds, to produce more grass. Even if we think that we aren't here for a purpose, every single one of us is here for similar purposes, different purposes, but we are here for a purpose, not just because of the fact that there's no purpose in being here.
Yeah, but the gentleman was simply asking for me to give you the answer what that purpose is, which I'm unable to do.
To observe what we've got,
Okay.
to admire and
When a
acknowledge
child,
this person.
if a child is 3 years of age, and you tell the child, I don't want you to ever step outside of the front gate and play on the footpath. And the 3-year-old has no idea why. You explain there are cars, etc., but the 3-year-old doesn't understand. Nevertheless, you make it a rule. That's what your 3-year-old does. It has to do why? Because you love him, you love her. But the child doesn't understand. We've also been given 613 do not play outside your front gate. And we're 3 years of age, very small brain. We don't know why. That's called humility.
But you can get answers on a much lower level.
Yes.
Looking at things that
Yes.
have happened in your life.
There's always deeper and deeper answers. you can see higher and higher purposes. With life's experience, with developing of the mind, with increased knowledge, etc., you get to a higher and higher appreciation. But always know that you're not going to get anywhere near the end result. At least not for 120 years.
What if acceptance and compassion doesn't give you emotional freedom?
Are you asking me if your practice of life through compassion doesn't work for you?
If you have got your frame
Yes.
and you're seeing suffering where people are presenting anger,
Yes.
and you're responding in a way that
That's
is
empathic, yeah.
empathic,
But it doesn't help.
and it makes no difference, and
Okay.
you are using acceptance as the frame from which...
Fine. I understand exactly what you're saying. And I'm going to answer very similar as I did to this gentleman. What's your name? Selwyn? Selwyn. I'm going to answer very similarly. Who says that if you do the right thing, it'll have the desired end that you perceive to be the correct one? Who says that you have the... Excuse me for being a little bit rude. Who says that you are the saviour who's going to save this person or intended to? Maybe, hear me out, maybe it's the 99th monkey of which you're number 21. And if it wasn't for you, 21, doing what you do, there could not be a 22. So you play a very essential role. But everyone between number 21 to 99 is not going to succeed because it doesn't tip the balance in that person. And only number 99 tips the balance and there's an aha experience. But that was a result because you at number 22 did what you did. But you won't see it.
I understand that, but if I go to the final part of that statement that I made about acceptance plus compassion doesn't result in emotional freedom yourself.
Good. So you have to ask yourself, what do I want? And if it's I want, you'll never have emotional freedom. In other words, take people who sometimes come to me and say, Laibl, I'm really practicing all this wonderful meditation. And I ask them, why are you practicing meditation? Oh, because it's really great. I feel terrific. I feel relaxed. I feel insightful. I feel this. And I say, forget it. You're doing it for all the wrong reasons. But I've enlarged myself as a human being, as a person. Forget it. You don't experience life for yourself. The reason why you want to grow as a person is to be a better facilitator, a better partner, a better parent, a better citizen, a better spouse. It's not part of our discussion, but ultimately emotional freedom and happiness comes from connectedness, relationship, not me. So if it's something that you want for yourself, you can't be free.
Laibl, can I ask you, I'm just backtracking a little bit, when you're talking about pain on the other side of the sheet, you're talking about pain is actual, and this is on the Kabbalah, you referred to that, but the pain is actually a break in the flow of the spirituality of the person. I've sort of got a question and maybe a bit of an answer as well. If a woman's giving birth,
Yes.
it's one of the most painful experiences that a woman can have.
So I'm told.
Same here.
Apart from hemorrhoids operations, but go on.
Don't want to go there.
Yep.
Coming back to that being a spiritual break, is that because the woman's also giving birth and there's a new spirit coming in, or?
No, it's because the physical body is being stretched to its outer limits, and therefore, as a consequence of that, it's momentarily distorted and makes it difficult for an idealized flow of energy through those particular parts of the body. Why it was designed that way, I can't tell you. I mean, we're told in Bereshit, but we're not going to go there.
Does that contradict the explanation of pain being a flow of spirituality?
Yeah, it doesn't. It's very it. In other words, when the body is distorted or contorted, if we place you or myself in a rather awkward physical position where our hands are being stretched beyond their normative stretch because we're being tortured, you're going to feel a lot of pain. Well, a woman is stretched at that moment. When the body, the physical body, is distorted, it therefore becomes lesser of a medium or a container for the spiritual flow. And that lessening is experienced as pain. Okay? I want to do a little meditation to conclude. So put everything out of your hands. And this little meditation, which some of you have done with me, is on gratitude. Gratitude is the way that we connect to Hashem every morning. So it's going to be based on an affirmation called Modeh Ani that we say every morning. And if you can move from the state of subconsciousness to consciousness, which is a very, very momentous moment from sleep to wakefulness, and adopt a positive posture, mental posture, emotional posture, in this instance emotional posture, then you can actually transform the way that you'll experience the day. That very first posture, emotionally, is terribly important and sets the pattern for the day. So just put everything out of your hands, put your feet symmetrically on the ground, hands on knees or thighs, back fairly straight, head well balanced on your shoulders, and gently close your eyes. And just focus on your breathing, gently breathing in and breathing out quite normally, and feel the coolness of the air as it enters and the relative warmth of the air as it exits. And just stay focused on that temperature difference. Modeh Ani, I thank you. Modeh Ani, I acknowledge. Modeh Ani, I submit my will to your higher will. Modeh Ani, I thank you, Hashem, for restoring my consciousness into my body this day. Modeh Ani, I acknowledge that every circumstance, challenge, situation that will arise for me today is a blessing to enable my growth. Modeh Ani, I abnegate my ego and will become other-centered today, empathic and compassionate, tolerant and patient. Modeh ani. I thank you, Hashem, for providing me with my uniqueness, my specialness, my giftedness. Modeh ani. I acknowledge that all the circumstances, even if they are painful, are ones which I will recognize a purpose within and allow the pain to recede in that knowledge. Modeh ani. I thank you for being here with me, personally, close by. Modeh ani lefanecha. I thank you right here in your presence, Melech Chai V'Kayam, you the King who animates and maintains existence, Shehechazarta bi Nishmasi, because you have given me back, restored my own identity, my soul. Bechemla, you've done that with compassion and mercy. Rabba emunasecha, great is your faith in me, and I won't let you down this day. Focus again on your breath, just being aware of the breath entering and exiting. Begin moving your fingers and your toes here in this room. Move your fingers, move your toes. And when you feel ready, gently open your eyes, coming all the way back here into the room. Enough for tonight. Those of you who are gluttons for punishment can come back next week. Next week is Tisha B'Av. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Next week there's no class. I apologize. Tisha B'Av is a fast day. The week after we resume. Thank you. It was a pleasure.